Assalamualaikum. I am going to start. It's 11:36, and we'll start because this gets recorded, and inshallah, it might benefit somebody. I'm Afshan Khan. I'm a child and adolescent psychiatrist. I practice in Westlake. We've been doing this for a year, mashallah, and we've had some really good success. We've had some really good speakers, and inshallah, hoping to have this mental health workshop going on for ongoing for every month, third Saturday of the month. I am going to talk about anxiety in children today. So I'm going to start with sharing my screen, and inshallah we'll kind of start and then go from there. Okay, awesome. Okay. My goal, can you guys hear me? Okay, perfect. Really, I do a lot of child psychiatry, and I see all kinds of struggles. The top struggles that I see in my practice really are anxiety and depression, bit of ADHD and autism. I feel like anxiety kind of varies in a lot of spectrum. It's a spectrum of kids that we kind of go from little kids, I also 3-year-olds with anxiety, to all the way to adults. I just want to really talk about basic stuff in anxiety, simple stuff. And then if you have concerns, questions, we'll be able to answer all of those at the end, inshallah, some of those. And then I'm happy to kind of redirect you to what needs to happen or where you need to go. And so the goal is really to kind of talk about just knowledge, information that you can have, so you're a little more aware about the illness. And that's where the mental health awareness workshops come about. We just want to kind of give basic information out there, so you know where to get help and what to kind of do with it. So really understanding anxiety. Often anxiety can present in so many different ways. I often say it's usually a sense of worry, dread, or fear it's a normal response sometimes. And it doesn't have to be a specific cause. People can have anxiety out of no reason, and it can go on without any specific cause. So people often, when I say you're anxious, they're like, I don't think so, I'm anxious. I have no worries. It doesn't have to be specifically related to the worry at that time. You may have gone through the whole stressful episode, and then you kind of see the anxiety coming about 3 or 6 months later because your body's reacting to it. And I often kind of like to define anxiety as good anxiety and bad anxiety. And that almost comes from, the whole evolution of psychiatry and evolution of anxiety. And we talk about fear. Fear is supposed to be an anxiety that is when your body's alerting you to some sort of fear of the future, failure, embarrassment. So you're reacting out of it. So I often give this example of we being predators and hunters as humans developed, and anxiety kept them aware of their environment and surrounding. And that's okay. So you can have good anxiety where you're worried and afraid because you have a test, you're worried about something bad's going to happen, and that's all. When it gets dysfunctional and it kind of persists even after reassurance, and multiple times the adults are saying it's okay, but it tends to kind of get dysfunctional, as in it stops you from going out, it stops you from doing your schoolwork, it stops you from really being dysregulated in your mood, then I call that as bad anxiety. Common fears. We want to talk about common fears for age. Most often infants and toddlers, they have the separation from caregivers, strangers, loud noises. They start crying and they're afraid, and you can see that in their eyes. Then between 2 and 3, usually it's about animals. It's about darkness, thunder and lightning, fire, water, kind of things. 4 to 5, you often have people worried about bugs, getting lost, losing their parents, feeling like there's monsters under the bed, and somebody's dying. They often fear losing their parent. 5 to 7 is usually about germs, illnesses. They kind of get a little bit of knowledge, so they're afraid. And COVID hasn't helped with that sort of fears for us. Natural disasters. They hear about tornado or they hear about hurricane somewhere, and they're like, oh, I'm not going there because this. And school, of course. What is going to happen if I go to school? There are strangers around. And 7 to 12, usually we see performance anxiety, really being able to talk in front of people, wanting to go somewhere and express themselves, advocate for themselves, school performances, social situations, being able to go out to HEB, asking for help, being in environments, often worried they're going to get kidnapped, there's going to be a war, and something bad's going to happen to them. So a lot of that happens between 7 to 12. And then I call forms of anxieties as different kinds, right? You have just sort of briefly understanding anxiety can present anyway, but often it's with phobias, strange fears of specific situations or objects. You're afraid of going outside, you're afraid of really engaging in certain activity because you're afraid that's going to lead to something. So it's a phobia of a spider, phobia about flying, phobia of walking high stairs. There could be phobias of anything. Panic usually is a word that often describes an intense fear with specific physical symptoms. So anxiety can be generalized where you're really feeling anxious all the time, but panic is when people sort of get to the point where they're afraid and they're presenting with physical symptoms. So you can see somebody in a panic attack. So anxiety is different and panic attacks different. Often I get a lot of people who have panic attacks and they don't understand, they don't have anxiety, but they do present with panic attacks where there's intense fear, the hands are shaking, the tremors. So they have all the physiological and physical symptoms of anxiety, and that's panic. Obsessions are when you have strong recurrent thoughts. In my practice with teenagers, I see a lot of obsessions. People want to kind of layer up their things in a certain way. They have to walk in a certain way, say, put pencils in a certain way, have to do a homework a certain way. They want to use only yellow color. And we all have our particular favorite things to do. But I think when we're talking obsessions, we're talking about people who just cannot change that attitude or cannot change that way of doing things because it really upsets them. And compulsion sort of falls in that obsession category. Is once you have an obsession of doing it in a certain way, then you kind of are, you have to act or thought pattern or do those thought patterns. Sometimes people say, if I say the number 3, you have to say 4 and 5 all the time. I can't stop it. And it's almost forced performance. It's not something they like to do. Initially, they might sort of start out by saying, okay, I have this obsession of doing things or a negative thought that comes to my mind. And if I do it, I move my hand in a certain way, I feel better. Eventually, it gets to a point where it gets ego dystonic is what I call it. That means they don't like doing it, but they're forced to do it. And it becomes like a compulsion. Usually, it also becomes an obsession. So obsession compulsion is a form of anxiety and it comes under OCD. And then again, social anxiety. Social anxiety is not being able to go to HEB, not being able to do things, not being able to talk to friends. And often kids do not really say, I have social anxiety. They often present with things like, they come and say, I went and I talked to 3 of my friends, but I came back and I was thinking I shouldn't have said this, I shouldn't have said that, I shouldn't have said this. And that sort of stops them from really going out and engaging with people, Some kids have struggled going even to HEB. So going to stores, doing things. So that's more like social anxiety. Trauma reactions. Sometimes people have a trauma and they're anxious past that. So that's a whole PTSD kind of field that is also a form of anxiety. We're not going to discuss that here, but that's something when a kid has gone through a trauma and every time they're going through similar episodes, they are more hypervigilant, they're always afraid, they have flashbacks of the trauma, and that's a form of an anxiety. So common symptoms of anxiety usually are expressed fears and worries, they're crying, irritability, oppositional behavior in young males. Usually we see a lot of anxiety presenting in young men with a lot of yelling, screaming, not listening to following directions. Sometimes kids get too goofy. They're anxious and they act silly and they're laughing inappropriately. They're completely dysregulated in their mood. Sometimes they present with being antsy, shaky, fidgety, moving the hands and legs constantly, not being able to pay attention. Memory is a big part of how you capture whatever you're learning in memory, and how anxiety plays a big role in having difficulty focus and attention. So definitely sometimes anxious kids present with poor performances at school. A lot of self-doubt, always checking themselves, always having parents check on them, being clingy, fearful about things, not wanting to go, school refusal sometimes, sleep disturbances. We get a lot of kids saying, I cannot sleep, I ruminate. When I say ruminate, the word would mean something where you're constantly thinking about things. You're always afraid, you're anxious, something bad's going to happen, and you constantly have to recheck that thought again and again, and you're unable to sleep. Some kids with OCD kind of behaviors present with repetitive patterns. They have to do certain way, they have to walk certain way, they have to get in the car from a certain side, they have to open the door certain times, tap the door sometimes. Sometimes they don't want to touch things. And then thoughts, they have repetitive thoughts, constantly worrying thoughts, they can't stop it. And then sometimes little kids often come up with repetitive questions. Are you going to be okay? Is it going to be okay? Are we going to be okay if we fly? a lot of repetitive questioning, and then panic. Panic's the physiological symptoms. Again, anxiety presents in different ways, like difficulty feeling agitated, avoiding activities, struggling to pay attention and focus. I do not want to dwell in ADHD part, but a lot of times I get a lot of kids who are presenting with anxiety. And I often, when I see their behaviors, I end up asking, has anybody ever told you that you may or may not have had ADHD, like you had struggles focusing in attention? And I kind of bring this up because there's a lot of kids, there's a lot of taboo about taking medications for ADHD. You know, it's a double-edged sword. You take medications and you're kind of not working organization skills, and you get used to the medication in some way. But if you don't treat the ADHD, you're an intelligent child, you're not getting the ADHD treated, your focus and attention is bad, so your brain is overfunctioning to keep up with that ADHD brain. It does present with a lot of anxiety, especially in high schoolers. I tend to see high schoolers who are struggling with grades. They've done really well in elementary and middle school, but when they get to high school, they're having struggles. Basically, they have ADHD, and now the not able to keep up with schoolwork presents with a lot of anxiety and struggles with that. I also see a lot of people with stomachache and headaches, have been to GI doctors, went through that whole rabbit hole of kind of getting their stomach aches done, colonoscopies done, MRIs done. And after 2 years of kind of doing all of that, somebody will tell them, you know, basically, I see somebody needs to treat the anxiety. So often checking in to know the physiological symptoms your child is presenting could have some root in anxiety. So often the anxiety part we talk about is a good understanding of, it's basically a vicious cycle of, you have a thought where you're saying, I don't like things, you feel sad, then your body tenses up, and then you start doing behaviors. Or either you have the behaviors, then your feelings are sad, and then you kind of, so it's a vicious cycle of thought, behavior, feeling, and body. And we'll talk about some of this in CBT. I just want to kind of put this out because cognitive behavioral therapy is a way to treat anxiety, and they use this pattern of how to break the thought so you don't feel that when your body does not react and your behaviors change. Going back to panic attack and common physical reactions, people have a lot of breathing fast, they have butterflies in their stomach, needing to go to the bathroom a lot, wobbly knees, shaky, tense muscles, and shakiness. So panic attack anxiety can present just as panic, and people can have physiological reaction to it. Often kids with anxiety also have common thinking errors. Just for their understanding, dark glasses, where they always are thinking about the negative parts of things. They're always making it personal. If they have a fight or things with friends, they end up saying, oh, I'm bad, that's why I'm in trouble, I am not doing things. There's a lot of blame game. They blame other people. They kind of struggle with it, not focusing, worried about somebody else is responsible. There's a lot of fortune telling. Fortune telling means they end up making up, like, the worst thing or catastrophic thinking is where they sort of say something really bad is going to happen and end up constantly focusing on that. And always the fortune telling has to be very negative, and there's no evidence to that. So there's a lot of thinking errors when somebody has anxiety. There's also overestimating probability. Our plane's going to crash, our car is going to get into a car crash, and they're overestimating their consequences. So they constantly come up with, yep, I'm not going to have fun because everybody's making fun. And honestly, I see this so often that I see kids, we start them on medication, and then we end up seeing a whole different kid who's able to engage in social. I have a kid who's a 12-year-old boy, did not want to go to school because he constantly thought people were making fun of him if he made a mistake. There was a lot of shame, constant shame about it. And suddenly we kind of get him therapy, get him on medication, and we see this kid going and enjoying and having fun. And if you ask him, what happened to those thoughts? I don't know. I don't have those thoughts anymore. I'm not afraid of people making fun of me. So there's a lot of overestimating of consequences. And they often end up, in anxiety behaviors, they end up having avoidance and escape. And I wanted to bring this up. It's basic. I often say, come to me when people or get help early on, because once you kind of get into patterns of avoidance and escape, those patterns, as they get older and stronger, it's harder to break with medication and therapy than when it's earlier on. It's almost like a graph. If you don't catch it here, then it's harder to catch it here. And then it makes it more harder to treat when people get into these patterns of avoidance and escape. So what maintains anxiety, right? you're anxious, you're afraid, you talk about it, and then you come up with coping strategies, maybe bad ones, but you come up with strategies of avoidance, allowing and encouraging that avoidance. Sometimes as parents, we're like, okay, my child does not like to eat this because it makes them very upset. And then you start kind of accommodating that anxiety and kind of encouraging that avoidance. Thinking errors, we never challenge them. Instead, we kind of support those thinking errors sometimes and say, okay, if you feel afraid, let's not do this. If you don't like this, let's not do this. And if they think, if they overestimate consequences, we agree with them and kind of say, okay, so it defines those thinking errors more strong. Lack of coping skills. We can go on about coping skills. We've had some more talks before, but we'll talk more about those coping skills. But often people do not understand how to kind of create ways to break through their anxiety. Excessive reassuring. If a child asks 10 times, the mother 10 times answers the same question without even feeling overwhelmed or even wanting to challenge that reassurance. Taking over. If your child's afraid, let me do this for you. Let me figure it out. Let me have you come sleep in my room. You're afraid of the monster. Let me sit here until you're not. So we take over a lot of times as parents, and preventing the child from developing coping skills. I guess helping kids manage anxiety. Most often parents get upset, yell at them to calm down, constantly reassure or ignore. Clearly, we're not supposed to do any of those. There's a calm strategy for parents. Usually it's catch your breath, pause to think, or withdraw briefly to become calm and plan a response, which is so hard to do as a parent when you're doing multiple other things. And as a parent, I know this personally. When your child's kind of constantly going after something and you're like, I just told you, but instead of I just told you, you just have to kind of calm down and plan a response. Accept negative feelings. Wait patiently, respond with, I see. Okay, I think when my child is anxious, is in pain, my immediate reaction is I'm anxious and I'm in pain. And so my first response is, I don't want to see you in pain. So I'm just going to try to kind of not accept this negative feeling and just jump in and save you, or jump in and ignore it, or jump in or yell so you go away and not talk about your negative feelings. So there's a lot of that as a parent we end up doing, right? So we really want to kind of sit down and say, okay, you're hurting and it's okay. I see it. Label emotions. And I think when you kind of calm down, you plan a response, you accept that negative feeling, you say, just label that emotion. I think it's good for kids. It's hard to kind of define those emotions and say, okay, you seem nervous, you seem afraid, you look sad. Those are nice things, because then the kid can really respond, okay, this is what sadness feels like, this is what nervousness feels like. And modeling the scoping strategies, right? Show your kid to remain calm and collected. And there's so many ways different parents do it. And I want to bring up the whole part of anxiety. I call anxiety a cough in medicine. If you're coughing, you take your kid to the doctor and say, hey, I gave my child this cough, I'm coughing, so my child is coughing. Anxiety is very similar. You're anxious as an adult, you know how to control your anxiety. But as a kid, you're transferring that same anxiety. And kids have different ways. Each of us have different ways of dealing with anxiety. So the whole family is anxious, yelling, screaming, chaos at home. As adults, we may be able to kind of say, okay, this is too loud, or this is too much, and I can know how to kind of control it, or I'm getting anxious because something big transitions are happening, but you're able to cope. But the child who is like a sponge absorbs all that anxiety and presents in its own way. Each child presents in its own way. So it's like cough. You give it to them, but you know how to manage it. Their cough presents in a different way. And that's why we really talk about understanding anxiety as a family, and how treatment of anxiety as a family is so important to understand these strategies. Again, going to general coping skills. Sleep. I can't sell enough of sleep. Sleep's where all your chemical regenerate, your brain's regenerating. Little kids, 8 to 10 hours, average 8 hours for kids. High schoolers, definitely at least 6 to 8 hours. And because that's where all your main building blocks of if you're not having good sleep, all your anxiety comes on, and it's a vicious cycle. Nutrition, we're really talking about moving psychiatry towards nutritional psychiatry and talking about eating and what we're eating. Most times we think I went to an international psychiatry conference and they were talking about salmon, and I was like, I don't need to eat salmon. I don't need to get more vitamin omega-3 fatty acids because I eat enough salmon. And they really was showing us the sample size of, you would really eat big 4 chunks of salmon to get that nutritional omega-3 fatty acid. So really we're way far off from what is available out there, what kind of nutrition we have, and what kind of food we have. We're also moving towards understanding how carbs, high glycemic index plays a role in how your brain develops or how it functions. So a lot of plant-based diet, taking away junk processed food, which has a lot of chemicals in it, plays a huge role. I have had kids who've kind of just done micronutrients with high doses of multivitamins doing better with their anxiety and not eating. So nutrition plays a big role in understanding the anxiety and how it plays a role. Exercise, we all know endorphins are released. Most kids need to kind of get out, get vitamin D, run, exercise to feel better, because it plays a huge role in your mental health. Social connections, post-COVID, in COVID, we all know or understand what it means to be in-person social connection, being able to talk to people one-on-one with friends, being able to engage in-person conversations plays a huge role in how you feel and how anxiety plays a role. And then building on strengths and interests, because we're focused on negative things. Sure, you're afraid of monsters. Sure, you're afraid to sleep in your room. But there are also other things you can focus on, which is building on your strengths and interests. Is if you use your brain and distract it with saying, okay, I am not good at this, and these are maybe my weaknesses, but I do have these strengths and interests. And how often, as a parent, even me, I end up struggling to kind of work on figuring out how to talk about my kids' strengths. Which means if you're going to give 3 negative comments, you need to overcompensate it with 9 to 21 positive comments, which is so hard. I'm like, why did you not pick up those clothes? Why did you put your shoes there? Instead of really kind of saying, great job, you put your bag and your lunchbox in the right place. So really building on strengths and interest and kind of engaging them in things they like, avoiding overbooking activities, running from one place to the other. I have a lot of kids who are coming here with anxiety, and we're like, how many AP classes are you in? 5. And have you thought about dropping the 2 soccer clubs that you're playing and not doing that while you're doing AP classes? You can't bring that up. People get upset because they like to feel accomplished by overbooking themselves, and really have to go back to the root cause of what does overbooking mean, and then we can treat the anxiety. And sometimes just leaving time to just be a kid. I have to take my kid in the morning. They have to do jujitsu. They have to do a piano class, or they have to do Quran class, and they have to do all of these. So where's the time for the kid to be a kid? And I think people forget the brain functioning and the development in kids, that we all sometimes just need to be a kid and give our brain that playtime. And coping skills, ability to calm down physically. When a kid is crying, yelling, screaming, we have to ask ourselves, what are we doing for them? Do we sit down and let them really calm down? It's okay to cry. You just have to sit there and help them calm down physically. And it might be like first thing in the morning, getting to school. What if they're late? And how do we help them? Really teaching them coping strategies of how to calm down and how to talk through the situation and problem solve and create a plan B. Because the minute you calm down and you're sitting there next to them and able to say, okay, sounds like you're having a tough morning, and then let them kind of say what they're upset about, or let them problem solve. And that's really kind of building coping strategies. We all know a couple of body relaxation strategies, you being aware of your physical signs of anxiety, taking deep breaths and deep breathing exercise. There are tons of it on YouTube, and muscle relaxation techniques, really, and visualization. Visualization is a big thing that often kids find it hard. Teaching my high schooler also, I find it so hard for her to kind of stop from what she's doing to kind of get into positive imagery. Most of the time she falls asleep, but really kind of saying, find your happy place, get there, feel like you're there for just a few minutes and seconds, and then bringing yourself there, and then letting your body relax. So when you're in that positive image, your body does its own chemical stuff. So you're in a better place when you open your eyes. So really work in visualization and making visualization a strength. So they know how to kind of use it as a tool. And I call all of these coping strategies as tools in their bucket. I tell kids that the goal is, when you're an adult, you're going to always have stressful situations. You're going to always have struggles. The goal is you build so many techniques that you can kind of get to a place where you can pull those tools out and use it when you're in a struggle phase. So you don't dip down to the deeper levels of anxiety, but just be able to manage it. Mindfulness is another one. It takes a little bit of practice, but really kind of going through 5, 2, 3, 1 of 5 things you can see, 4 things you can touch, 3 things you can hear, 2 things you can smell, and 1 thing you can taste. So it's nice for younger kids to kind of work on it. So that way it's a good distraction technique, and eventually kind of letting your body be in its space and feel it and touch it, and using your sensations to kind of bring yourself into the moment rather than being overwhelmed with the anxiety. The other part when your kid is anxious is we jump into wanting to problem solve. That's our own anxiety. I have to check in so often with myself when my kids are saying something is, oh my God, I'm upset because I'm anxious that she's worried about this exam, or she's anxious because she can't find her shoes, or so. But my immediate reaction of wanting to help her is never, I want to problem solve. I want to take care of them. And that's just what we do as parents. But sometimes you just have to sit down and really kind of go through detective thinking is what I call the 1/3 rule. 1/3 rule is when people are having struggles, 1/3 of the time when people are repeating the questions, 1/3 of the time you actually ignore those repetitions. 1/3 of the time you just acknowledge them, saying, oh, I hear you. You're upset about your tests. I hear you. You're upset about things. I hear you can. And 1/3 of the time, sit down and go after it in a detective thinking way, really saying, okay, tell me more about what you're worried about. And say, I see your exams in 2 days and you're worried about this. And then how likely is it that this bad thing can happen? Sometimes kids are talking about, I'm going to get lost. And then said, how many times has this really happened? And really kind of doing more of a rational, logical explanation and say, what if you get lost? What if you fail the test? What's the worst thing that can happen? So they're always afraid to go to what if this will really happen. And once they go there, you then can walk them backward of how often this has happened, and really kind of doing it more logical and rational way. But really sitting down and letting them do the work rather than, no, this is not going to happen. You're not going to get lost. You're going to do well at the test. Those are fine reassurances, but constant reassurance only undermines the detective thinking and their own strengths. And having them face fears, right? Slowly taking small steps to face fears. Kids usually talk about difficulty falling asleep in their own bed. Okay, that is a valid fear. Validate. I say, anytime kids present with anxiety, do not challenge that. Don't call it, that's not a right thing to think of, or that's not how it's going to do. To pray and you will be done. Those are all great tools. Praying, again, like I call religion a big anti-anxiolytic. If you have tawakkul, it will play its role as an anxiolytic. What it means is really kind of letting kids, and I think that's a beautiful way to teach our religion to our kids in a way, and say, what would a prophet do? Or what would this be in terms of meaning how much you trust Allah? And using that more as a tool rather than the only tool. So that way, when kids are afraid, you give them other tools, but also give them religion as a tool to kind of work through bad times, work through what is meant to happen, and who you need to look forward to pray or ask for help. And that becomes a tool rather than just only tool. And then when the kid really does it, rewarding child, especially in the younger kids, there's a huge lot of visual cues, putting up a board, saying, if you have slept in your bed for 10 days, then this is what we can reward you, and things like that. So really rewarding your child for facing fears, and kind of having more visual and treasure hunts and obvious rewards for them to kind of say, because that's going to be what it is to conquer that fear. And I often say anxiety is more like something's outside of you. And my easiest example for kids is video games. I say, if you love playing video games, who wins? You win, or the anxiety wins? If you let the anxiety win, then it becomes stronger, right? So you kind of, and every time you win, and that's true in chemical reaction wise. When people start facing the fears and fighting the anxiety, they tend to get better and better at it, because your body starts producing those chemicals, and you get stronger, and the anxiety goes down. The more you let the anxiety win, the more. And I think really telling, sometimes kids come and tell me that I'm an anxious child. I'm like, no, nobody's an anxious child. You're a child, and there's anxiety, and that's taking over, and you just have to push it away. And using your parent power, right? You act brave, you work through things, you give your own examples, talk about your non-anxious behavior, or even talk about your anxious behavior. Validating that shame, right? Validating that I was anxious and I was afraid and how I coped. Being gentle, which is, as a parent, sometimes it takes work, yet encouraging, right? Really kind of being there and modeling out that calmness, paying attention to their non-brave and non-anxious behaviors when they're being brave. We are so busy always picking up as parents on all the negative things our child. And I can't tell you, there's so much work that needs to happen all the time for us to really say, great, you did a good job at this. Awesome, you actually did this. You did this without getting anxious. You did this being calm. You actually were able to do this. So really kind of paying attention to their positive behaviors constantly. And teaching shame resilience. This is such a big thing. Shame is a human thing, and how it is okay to be being embarrassed in front of people, being vulnerable. Teaching your kids to say, okay, you fall down and people make fun, it's okay. That's just embarrassing, but accepting that embarrassment, because the more you shun it off, not talk about it, the more there's lack of resilience towards shame. In schools, we really talk about schools, ensuring teachers understand anxiety levels. So if your child is kind of going through school refusals, refusing to kind of go to school, not talking, having struggles with anxieties, having struggles with grades, having struggles with sitting somewhere, talk to the teachers about it. More than likely, the teacher would know about it and be able to help or come up with strategies, coping strategies to help your kid kind of get through that anxiety level. There are special policies and laws. 504 accommodations is one of those. It is under the right for every child for education, and that helps your kid sit in front of the thing, get your child to walk out of the class if need be. It can go on a higher level where there's an individualized educational plan. Public schools provide all of these things for people who are deserving and needy of what kind of, it all depends on which school has what kind of resources, but there's it can go from 504, which is pretty simple, changing a couple of things to help your kid accommodate, to a whole individualized educational plan to say what target goals they have and how they're going to achieve it in a year by helping the kid achieve those goals. So there's a lot at schools if you're having struggle. And the biggest answer as a school refusal for me is send them to school. If they're afraid to school, send them. It can be in a way stepwise progression. Can't go to school, just go sit in your counselor's office all day long. If you after you're done with the counselor's office, go sit in the class. Don't worry about grades. Sit there. Once you're at that, start paying attention and then go on afterwards. But really kind of school refusal answer is sending to school. And then adapting study skills as needed, learning ways. Each kid is different. Some like to sit in front of the TV and study. Some like to listen to music. Some like to sit on a rocking chair. We're really talking about learning habits. I wish there was more of this when I was growing up, but things are kind of different now with people having wobbly chairs in schools where they can really rock, while some kid likes to rock, some kid likes to move the pencil constantly. Each of us have a different way of learning style, and knowing your child's learning style. Some are more morning people, they wake up in the morning and are studying, some study late. So really helping your kid figure it out and saying it's okay to do whatever works best for you, and figuring out and individualizing and making it unique for your child. So they really kind of accommodate that and say, this is my strength. I do better when I'm sitting on this rocking chair and I'm studying, and kind of motivating them and advocating for their own needs. And then really identifying that relevant accommodation, supporting if need be. And teach child that mistakes can be good teachers, really kind of accepting your mistakes and being aware and being resilient towards it. Even at school, if your kid drops a grade, that's fine. My often question for kids is, what if 5 years later, would you know how much you scored in so-and-so test? Will that matter? What if you didn't make a good grade on a certain grade? 5 years later, would that matter at all? So really kind of giving them more of a broader vision and a bigger picture to create that resilience. Test taking strategies. A lot to kind of talk about this if this specific, but really getting specifics of test content and delivery. Some kids are great understanding the subject, but do not know how to kind of give a test. You just work on their look at what the test contents are, practice tests, and how it's being done, what are their struggles, and sit down and work instead of just after they're done the test and saying, okay, you don't take well, test well. That doesn't help. They don't have to know that. They know it because the score says it. So how do you help your kid figure out, debrief of how to best help your kid? And like I said, there are always alternate test formats and locations with teacher discuss, practice what you're weak at and motivate the strengths. And then finding calming and thinking techniques. If the kid's really anxious, their anxiety stops your brain from having access to your memory zones, your concentration, attention. So we really need to figure out where the anxiety is and how do you help your kid calm and think better. Coming to professional help, we talk about this at the end usually because we really want to, there's a spectrum of anxiety, right? Somebody who's anxious and is managing, somebody who's anxious and having struggles and is in distress, but still managing, some who are in pain, in distress, unable to function. So there's a whole spectrum of things, and there's a whole spectrum of professional help. I often say get help initially, because then as a psychiatrist, I tell people, come in and I'll tell you, you need more help, you don't need help. You can start with the therapist, or you need medication, you just need some supplements. We'll be able to define that, but don't leave it too long because it gets harder to treat anxiety as it gets worse. Cognitive behavioral therapy, that's the most common kind of therapy for anxiety. What it means is we go back to that whole thought, behavior, feeling, and your body reaction cycle where you have automatic negative thought. I'm going to explain CBT in a very common thing. I see a lot of eating disorder kids. Eating disorder can itself be an anxiety thing, control of situation. Eating disorder kids looks at a piece of cake and says, I'm not going to eat this because I'm going to gain 10 pounds. And I often say, how is a piece of cake related to 10 pounds? It's not, but that's where the brain goes immediately, and then comes up with negative images, body images and stuff. But when you look at the piece of cake, you're not thinking how it's gone to the 10 pounds. It just automatically goes there. And that's where we kind of pick up a thought and say, tell me a little more about why you think this, and then kind of breaking down those thoughts. There are a couple of good books, we'll talk about it in a minute here, but CBT is basically changing that negative automatic thoughts and changing your behavior and helping anxiety. Skill building group therapy, a lot of group therapy. If kids do not like individual therapy, they're group therapy to go to. There's a lot of parent coaching. Sometimes we find that the child is just a victim. There's somebody else who's anxious, who's yelling, screaming, or upset, or angry, or wants to control things, and parenting becomes a control thing. So I often say, go back and revisit and figure out anxiety is usually in the family, and how can we help parents figure out that? As a psychiatrist, people tend to ask, and I meant to write that can be brief, is because people often say when you go to get on meds, they're often afraid that the child is going to be on medication all their life. As a psychiatrist, I don't see people for all their life unless you have really chronic condition. I see people who have anxiety come, get treated, and in 6 months to 2 years, they're done with the treatment. The goal of medication, as a psychiatrist, I do a lot of medication management. The goal of medication management is helping kids or people figure out how do they work through some of the therapy. So medication just fast forwards the process. And there are tons of things out there, like the anti-anxiety medication, as simple as Benadryl, and that we can use for anxiety. Sometimes we end up using antidepressants, which help with making things better, so they're able to participate in therapy, push through this. So definitely medications can have a role if things are out of hand and dysfunctional. Some of the resources I have is Brené Brown. She's known for her gifts of imperfection, great author from Houston. She's written lovely books. She has a Netflix show where the family can watch, and she talks about shame, resilience, embarrassment. Kristen Neff at UT Austin, again, a great author on on anxiety. Mind Over Mood, it's a very good book. It's about $15 on Amazon. It helps kind of break you down. I ask family to sit down and do it together. You get it. It's almost like a workbook. You kind of take the thought, why did you feel that way? What came through you? And the more you do the workbook, the more aware you are of your feelings and emotions. Great book. There's a CBT toolbox for kids. Really helps kids kind of figure out techniques, how to manage the anxiety. I often call childhood as a training battlefield to be an adult. And the goal is, if you're stressed, you're going to be more stressed as an adult. And how do you cope with it? And what kind of toolbox are you going to have when you're an adult to go through stressful situations? And how do you cope with it? So definitely, I think if there's mild anxiety, there's a lot of resources out there just to start off and work through some of these things. So that's my talk. I'm going to stop the share and see if anybody has any questions. Is there anything I could answer? We have anything that we didn't cover? You all have any questions? Feel free to put it in the chat box, or if you want to kind of talk, we're happy to answer those. I'm going to give it a minute or two here if you guys have any questions. No questions? Okay, I'm going to stop the recording here.